extended to 6:30 and other times adjusted accordingly.
Without objection.
Mr. President, a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to visit with one of my really, truly heroes. I don't want that up yet. Oh, that's all right. Go ahead and leave it up. That's okay. Benjamin Netanyahu, who's just here and graces with his presence this week. And I, just last March, I was in Jerusalem, had some quality time with him, and we kind of relived experiences that we've had in the past. When he was Prime Minister before, and that was back in the middle of the 1990s, I had a chance to talk to him, and I can recall his concern at that time and what he said at that time. Two major concerns. One is what's happening in Iran, and then, of course, making sure that the land that is in Israel right now will stay there. Well, recently I had a chance to visit with him again, and I was really quite surprised when he came here and it was met with this suggestion that things are going to change and that maybe we would encourage Israel to go back to their 1967 borders. And I can assure you that we'll do everything we can to keep that from happening. And I want to make sure we get the message out there. This is that maybe President Obama talking is not the majority of people in America, as was witnessed by the 30 standing ovations that Prime Minister Netanyahu got in his joint speech. And, you know, it sounded familiar when we were talking about this, about the land, Mr. President, and I remembered that it was 10 years ago, right, 2001, that I made a speech, and it jogged my memory when I heard the President talking about going back to the 1967 borders. And so I dug up that speech, I found it, and I found that it is so appropriate today. In fact, this was a speech, by the way, the research done for this speech was done by a guy named Willie George, who is a preacher, a pastor, but a historian. And I want to put the same perspective on this that we did 10 years ago and see how that applies today. First of all, I'm going to do something that's unusual on the floor of the Senate, and that is, I'm going to quote Ephesians 6. Listen carefully. It says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." It's significant that we look at that, because make no mistake about it, the war that was started 10 years ago, and the war that we're in right now, that we're fighting now, is a war, first and foremost, a spiritual war. It's not a political war, never has been a political war. It's not about politics. It's a spiritual war. It has its roots in spiritual conflict. It is a war to destroy the very fabric of our society and the very things for which we stand. Now, many of the wars in history are wars where people are trying to take over something another country has. That's not what this is about. Not about getting mineral deposits, not about getting land from other countries. This is a different war. It's not just simple greed that motivates these people to kill. One may ask, what is about our nation that makes them, and here I'm talking about some of the Hamas, Hezbollah, the terrorists, hate us so much in this country? I suggest there are three things. First, in our country, we have the freedom and the right to choose the kind of worship we want. I happen to be a Jesus guy. I'm born again Christian, all that. And I believe the way to the Lord is to God is through his Son. Now, while I believe that, I believe every American has the right to choose whether or not he or she wants to believe that. Some people have the notion that if you're a Christian who believes in the Bible, you're totally intolerant. You do not allow other people to have a choice. Nothing could be further from the truth. The nations of this world where Christianity is the dominant way of worship, we also find Jewish synagogues, we find Islamic mosques, we find freedom of worship, but we will not find the same kinds of things in the militant Islamic nations of this world. They don't allow Christian churches. They don't allow synagogues to open freely. They don't allow people the freedoms. They persecute people. So one of the reasons America is hated so much is that we have allowed people through the years to choose what they're going to do. It's their choice. The second reason that we're hated so much is we have opened the door for people to achieve their God-given place on this earth. We have not restrained people. We have allowed people freedom of expression, the freedom to pursue dreams, the freedom to pursue goals. This is not true in other places in the world. These freedoms are not found in every nation. America is great because we have magnified the rights of individuals, protected the rights of individuals in our culture. We are careful to allow people to have expression in our society, and we are hated for it. The third reason we're hated by these people is that because we're a nation of laws. We are a people ruled by laws, lest one thinks that's common. You go around the world and look at these other countries in the world. Most of the world's countries don't have a 200-year-old constitution. They are ruled by dictators. They are ruled by the whims of those leaders or by political parties as they change. The rule of law is what makes civilization possible. The rule of law is what makes an orderly society work. If there's no rule of law, the strongest, toughest bully on the block is the one who's running the country. Now, America is a country of law and order. Because of the philosophies of the people who founded our nation, they believed in the rule of law because of what they knew from the Bible. Our Constitution and the constitutions of most governments around the world, similar to ours, are indeed based on the Ten Commandments. Our fathers knew that the Ten Commandments and the laws of God should be a basis for all laws. They understood the concepts of absolute right and absolute wrong. There were not many who believed in what we call today situational ethics, or where things change according to our needs. They believed in absolute right and absolute wrong. That's the reason that we are hated so much as a nation. We are hated because we are a beacon of light, a beacon of freedom all the way around the world. We know contemporarily what this means. One of the greatest speeches of all times that I remember is a speech that was made by Ronald Reagan. It was called A Rendezvous with Destiny. And this speech, he talked about, this is back when Castro first took over Cuba, and he talked about the atrocities in communist Cuba. And people were trying to escape. And one man escaped in a small boat, as many others did. And he lived to reach the coast of Florida. And as his boat floated up on the coast, he started telling the people who were there about the atrocities of communist Cuba. And a lady responded and said, well, I guess we in this country don't know how lucky we are. And he said, no, it is how lucky we are because we had a place to escape to. Now, what he was saying is we were that beacon of freedom. And we are hated because we are a beacon of freedom. And that's the third reason. For the rest of the world, we are hated because in America we have a freedom of choice, a freedom of worship. We have freedom of expression. We are a nation of laws. Now, why was America attacked on September 11th? Why did they single us out? America was attacked because of our system of values. It's a spiritual war. It's not just because we are Israel's best friend. We are Israel's best friend in the world because of the character we have as a nation. One of the reasons God has blessed our country is because we have honored his people. Now, right there on your desk, Mr. President, you have a Bible. If you look up Genesis 12:3, it says, and listen carefully, he says, I will bless them that bless you and curse him that curses you. And he was talking about Israel. One of the reasons America has been blessed abundantly over the years is because we, as a society, have opened our doors to the Jewish people. Jewish people have been blessed in the United States of America. When the tiny state of Israel was founded in 1948, we stood in the beginning with Israel. We were the first country to stand for Israel, and because we took a stand, other nations in the world took a stand, and they followed quickly. The United States made it possible for there to be in Israel. We stood with Israel again and again and again in its fight to survive. Make no mistake about it. It's not just because our support of Israel, it is what we believe as a nation that caused us to come under attack. And Israel is under attack in the Middle East because it is the only true democracy that exists in the Middle East. There are more than 20 Arab countries that are in northern Africa and in the Middle East, and nearly every one of those is run by a dictator. Israel is the only true democracy that exists in the Middle East. And Mr. President, did you know if you are an Arab in Israel and you are an Israeli citizen as an Arab, you can vote in the elections? In fact, in the Knesset, that's their Congress, they have a political party that is for Arabs. They have their own party in the Knesset. Israel is the only true democracy that exists in the Middle East. It has a Western form of government based on the laws we see in the Bible. The laws of God that our country is based on are the same laws from which Israel gets its law. It represents the laws of God. That's the reason it is under attack. We ought to be Israel's best friend. If we can't stand for Israel today, can we ever again be counted on as a beacon of hope, a beacon of freedom for the oppressed nations? You may ask, what does this have to do with the attack on America that happened 10 years ago? We are under attack because of our character and because we have supported the tiny little nation in the Middle East. That is why we're under attack. If we don't stand for this tiny country today, when do we start standing for tiny little countries in the world that are right? Many years ago, Yasser Arafat and others did not recognize Israel's right to the land, very much like our President Obama. Even today, many don't recognize Israel's right to exist. There are 7 reasons I consider to be indisputable and incontrovertible evidence and grounds to Israel's right to the land. And you have heard this before because you heard it from me 10 years ago, and it was somewhere, it's in the record now, but I kept it. Most know this, that they're going to be hit by skeptics who are going to say that we are being attacked all because of our support for Israel, and if we get out of the Middle East, all of the problems will go away. That's not so. It's not true. We all know in our hearts it's not true. If we withdraw, it would come to our door and would not go away. I have some observations to make about that in a minute, but first, I want to tell you the 7 reasons that Israel has the right to the land. And I'm saying this because I'm still in shock over what happened this last week. But I am relieved from the response that we got from this great man, Prime Minister Netanyahu. Israel has a right to the land, reason number 1, because of all the archaeological evidence. This is reason number 1. It supports it. Every time there is a dig in Israel, it does nothing but support the fact that Israelis have had a presence there in that land for over 3,000 years. The coins, the cities, the pottery, the culture, there are other people and other groups there, but there is no mistaking the fact that the Israelis have been present for 3,000 years. It predates any claims that any other peoples in the region might have. The ancient Philistines are extinct. They're not around anymore. Many other ancient people are extinct. They do not have an unbroken line to this date. The Israelis have. Even the Egyptians of today are not racial Egyptians of 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. They're primarily an Arab people. The land is called Egypt, but they're not the same racial and ethnic stock as the old Egyptians of the ancient world. The Israelis are, in fact, descended from the original Israelites. The first proof, then, is the archaeological proof. Now, the second proof of Israel's right to the land is the historic right. History supports it totally and completely. We know that there's been an Israel up until the time of the Roman Empire. The Romans conquered the land. Israel had no homeland. Although Jews were allowed to live there, they were driven from the land in 2 dispersions in 70 AD and in 135 AD. But there was always a Jewish presence in the land. The Turks, who took over about 700 years ago and ruled the land up until about World War I, had control. Then the land was conquered by the British. The Turks entered World War I on the side of Germany. The British knew they had to do something to punish the Turks and also to break up the empire that was going to be a part of the whole effort of Germany in World War I. So the British sent troops against the Turks in the Holy Land. This is a good one. One of the generals who led the British into the Holy Land was a guy whose name was Allenby. He was a general. He was a Bible-believing Christian. He carried a Bible with him everywhere he went, and he knew the significance of Jerusalem. The night before the attack against Jerusalem, to drive out the Turks, Allenby prayed that God would allow him to capture the city without doing damage to the holy places. That day, Allenby, this is World War I now, keep in mind, he sent a bunch of biplanes into the Holy Land as a reconnaissance mission. Now, you have to understand, these Turks had never seen a biplane. They'd never seen any kind of airplane. They looked up and they saw these cute little machines flying around. They're terrified. They're terrified of it. Then they were told that they are being opposed by a man named Allenby. This is a true story. History supports it. Allenby, in their language, means man sent from God or prophet from God. They dared not fight against a prophet from God. So the next morning, when Allenby went into Jerusalem, he went in and captured it without firing a shot. And that is history. That's actually what happened. That's the history that we're talking about. Now, out of gratitude to the Jews and out of gratitude to the Jewish bankers and the financiers and others who lent financial help on the homeland, the Jewish people, the homeland that is now Israel, all of what was then the nation of Jordan was given to the Jewish people. The homeland that Britain said it would set aside consisted of all of what is now Israel and all of what then was Jordan. The whole thing. And that was what the British promised the Jews in 1917. Now, in the beginning, there was some Arab population there and some Arab support for this gift. There was not a huge Arab population. In the land at the time, there was a reason for that. The land was not able to sustain any kind of a large population. The people, it just didn't have the development it needed to handle any kind of a population in the land. It really wasn't wanted by anyone. Can you believe that? Israel was not wanted at that time by anyone. I want you to listen to what Mark Twain said. Remember Mark Twain? He did Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, and it was Samuel Clemens. He took a tour of the Holy Land in 1867. This is how he described it. We are talking about Israel. He said, and I'm quoting, he said, "A desolate country whose soil is rich enough but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. We never saw a human being on the whole route. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of worthless soil, had almost deserted the country." Where was this great Palestine at that time? Where was the Palestinian nation? It didn't exist. It wasn't there. The Palestinians weren't there. Palestine was a region named by the Romans, but at the time it was under the control of the Turks. And there was no large population there because the land wouldn't support a large population. This is the report they had. There was a Palestinian Royal Commission that was created by the British. And it quotes an account of the conditions on the coastal plain along with the Mediterranean Sea in 1913. This is the Palestinian Royal Commission. This is what they said about Israel at that time. They said, quote, "The road leading from Gaza to the north was only a summer track, suitable for transport by camels or carts. No orange groves, orchards, or vineyards were to be seen until one reached the Yavnev village. Houses were mud, schools did not exist. The western part toward the sea was almost desert. The villages in this area were few and thinly populated. Many villages were deserted by their inhabitants." And the French author Voltaire said that Palestine was a hopeless, dreary place. In short, under the Turks, the land suffered from neglect and low population. And it's a historical fact. The nation became populated with both Jews and Arabs. The land came to prosper when the Jews came back and began to reclaim it. Historically, they began to reclaim it, even if there had never been any archaeological evidence to support the right of the Israelis to the territory. It's important to recognize that other nations in the area have no long-standing claim to the country either. And Mr. President, this may even surprise you. So I would say, Mr. President, did you know that Saudi Arabia was not created until 1913, Lebanon until 1920, Iraq didn't exist as a nation until 1932, Syria until 1941. The borders of Jordan were established in 1946 and Kuwait in 1961. Now, any of these nations who would say that Israel is only a recent arrival would have to deny their own rights as they were recent arrivals as well. They didn't exist as a countries. They were all under control of the Turks. So historically, the land was given to the Israelis in 1917, and then, of course, we know that Israel gained its independence in 1948. Now, so we have the archaeological reasons. We have 7 reasons: archaeological reason, the historical reason, but here's the third reason. The third reason I believe it belongs to Israel is because of the practical value of the Israelis being there. Israel today is a modern marvel of agriculture. Israel is able to bring more food out of the desert environment than any other country in the world. The Arab nations ought to make Israel their friend and import technology from Israel that would allow all the Middle East, not just Israel, to be exporters of food. Right now it's only Israel. So Israel unarguably has the success in its agriculture. They have been able to develop it when nobody else has. The fourth reason I believe that Israel has the right to the land is on the ground of humanitarianism. You see, there are 6 million Jews slaughtered in Europe in World War II. The persecution against the Jews was very strong in Russia since the advent of communism. Persecution was against the Jews even before that time under the czars. These people have the right to their homeland. If we are not going to allow them a homeland in the Middle East, then where? What other nation on earth is going to cede territory? They are not asking for a great deal. You know, the whole nation of Israel fits into my state of Oklahoma 7 times. So on humanitarian grounds alone, Israel ought to have the land. The fifth reason that I disagree with President Obama and think that Israel should have the right to the land without any changes, not going back to 1967, is because it is a strategic ally to the United States. Now, whether we realize it or not, Israel is a detriment and an impediment to certain groups hostile to democracies and hostile to those things that we believe in, hostile to the very things that make us the greatest nation in the history of the world. Israel has kept them from taking complete control of the Middle East. If it were not for Israel, they would overrun the region. Israel is our only strategic ally. And Mr. President, it's good to know that we have a friend in the Middle East that we can count on. They vote with us in the United Nations more than England, more than Germany, more than Canada, more than France, more than any other country in the world. And so they have been our consistent ally for strategic reasons. The sixth reason that Israel should be entitled to the land is that Israel is a roadblock to terrorism. The war we are now facing is not a war against a sovereign nation. It is a fluid group of terrorists moving from one country to another. They are almost invisible. That is who we are fighting against. We need every ally we can get. If we do not stop terrorism in the Middle East, it will be on our shores. Now, I've said this and said this and said this. One of the reasons I believe the spiritual door was open for an attack against the United States is because of the policy of our government has been to ask the Israelis to demand with pressure that they not retaliate against the terrorist attacks that have been launched against them. Now, since its independence in 1948, Israel has fought 4 wars. In all these wars, they were not the aggressor. They weren't the aggressor in any of the wars. Some people might argue that with Egypt that they were the first ones there. No, Egypt was building up, and everybody knew what was going to happen. You have to understand that in all 4 cases, Israel was attacked. Well, and Israel won all 4 wars against impossible odds. They are great warriors. I've spent some time over there. They consider a level playing field to be outnumbered 2-1, and they're great people. There are 39 Scud missiles that landed on Israel's soil during the Gulf War. Our president asked Israel at that time, remember our policy was to try to get them not to respond. We asked them at that time not to respond. In order to have the Arab nations on board, we asked Israel not even to participate in the war. They showed incredible restraint. They did not. And we asked them to stand back and not do anything over these attacks. We have criticized them. They have been criticized in our media. Our local people in television and radio offer criticism of Israel, not knowing the true issues. We need to be informed. Years ago, I was so thrilled when I heard a reporter posed a question to our former Secretary of State, Colin Powell, during the Gulf War. He said, Mr. Powell, the United States has advocated a policy of restraint in the Middle East. We have discouraged Israel from retaliation again and again and again because we have said that it leads to continued escalation, that it escalates the violence. He said, are we going to follow, we, the United States, going to follow that preaching ourselves? Mr. Powell indicated that we would strike back. In other words, we can tell Israel not to do it, but when it hits us, we're going to do it. And that's one of the reasons that I believe the door was open, because we held back our tiny little friend. We have not allowed them to go to the heart of the problem. This was a mistake. Terrorism is not going to go away. If Israel were driven into the sea tomorrow, and every Jew in the Middle East were killed, terrorism would not end. You know that in your heart, terrorism would continue. It's not just a matter of Israel and the Middle East. It's the heart of the very people who are perpetrating this stuff. You know, should they be successful in overrunning Israel? They won't be, but should they be, it would not be enough. They will never be satisfied. And we learned that in Camp David. Now, the seventh reason, and this is going to upset a lot of people, but I've got to say it because it's obvious and it's printed right up there on the desk. I believe very strongly the seventh reason that we ought to support Israel is that it has a right to the land. This is the most important reason. Are you ready for this? Because God said so. As I said a minute ago, look it up in the book of Genesis. Genesis 13, verse 14, 15, and 17. The Bible says, the Lord, this is very specific too. This is very interesting. A lot of people forget this. The Lord said to Abram, lift up now your eyes and look from the place where you are northward, southward, eastward, westward, for all the land which you see, to you will I give it, and to your seed forever. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it to thee. That's God talking. He's talking about Israel. The Bible says that Abraham moved his tent and came to dwell in the plain of Mamre, which is in what we call the Hebron, and built there an altar before the Lord. Hebron is in the West Bank. It's the West Bank. Right here is what we're talking about. Is the place where God appeared to Abraham and said, I am giving you this land, the West Bank. Now, I can hear everyone yelling and screaming now about this because you're quoting the Bible, but that's their problem, not mine. This is not a political battle at all. It's a contest over whether or not the Word of God is true. The seven reasons here, I'm convinced, clearly establish that Israel has a right to the land. Years ago on the lawn of the White House, Yitzhak Rabin shook hands with PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat. It was a historic occasion. It was a tragic occasion. At the time, the official policy of the government of Israel began to be, quote, let us appease the terrorists, let us begin to trade the land for peace. They tried. This process continued unabated here in our own nation, in Camp David, in the summer of 2000. I remember it so well when Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered the most generous concessions to Yasser Arafat that had ever been on the table. He offered him more than 90%, listen to this, more than 90% of all of the West Bank territory, sovereign control of it. There were some parts he did not want to offer, but in exchange for that, he said he would give up land in Israel proper that the PLO was not even asking for. And he also did the unthinkable, that we can't imagine today. He even talked about dividing Jerusalem and allowing the Palestinians to have their capital there in the east. Yasser Arafat stormed out of the meeting. Now, why did he storm out of the meeting? Why would he storm out? Everything he asked for was offered to him. Everything. A couple of months later, when there began to be riots and terrorism, the riots began when Ariel Sharon went to the Temple Mount. We all remember this. And this was used as the thing that lit the fire that caused the explosion. This is the excuse they used. I'm talking about the terrorists. Did you know that Sharon did not go to the Temple Mount unannounced? He contacted the Islamic authorities before he went. He secured their permission. He had permission to be there. It was no surprise. The response was very carefully calculated. They knew they would not pay attention to the details. And so they would portray this as in the Arab world as an attack on the Holy Mosque. They would portray it as an attack upon a mosque and use it as an excuse to riot, and we know what's happened since that time. Over the following years, during the time of the peace process where the Israeli public has pressured its leaders to give up land for peace because they're tired of fighting, there has been increased terror. It hasn't helped. It hasn't worked. Nothing has worked. In fact, it's been greater than at any other time in Israel's history. Showing restraint and giving in has not produced any kind of peace. It is so much so that the leftist peace movement in Israel did not exist because the people felt they were deceived. They did offer a hand of peace, and it was not taken. That's why the politics of Israel have changed drastically. The Israelis have come to see that, quote, no matter what we do, these people do not want to deal with us. They want to destroy us. And that's why even yet today, the station area of the PLO has upon it a map of the entire state of Israel, not just the tiny part that they call the West Bank. They want it all. The unwavering loyalty we have received from our only consistent friend in the Middle East has got to be respected and appreciated by us. No longer should foreign policy in the Middle East be one of appeasement. As Hiram Mann said, no man survives when freedom fails. The best men rot in filthy jails, and those who cried appease, appease, are hanged by those they tried to please. Islamic fundamentalism, terrorism has come to America. It came to America on 9/11. We have to use all of our friends, all of our assets, all of our resources to defeat the satanic evil. Patrick Henry said, we are not weak if we make the proper use of those means which the God of nature have placed in our power. Armed in the holy cause of liberty in such a country as that which we possess, we're invincible by any force our enemy can send against us. Now listen to this. Besides, we will not fight our battles alone. There's a just God who reigns over the destinies of nations, who will raise up friends and fight our battles with us. And he was talking about all of our friends, including Israel. And that's what is happening. Thank God that Israel is in the battle by our side. It's time for our policy of appeasement in the Middle East and appeasement to the terrorists to be over with our partners. And victory, it's going to have to be an absolute victory. I mentioned that a few weeks ago I was with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, and at that time his concern, he had this growing concern for the land. We didn't know what was coming. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know that which did happen just a week ago was going to happen. And I'll quote this now from the Associated Press. It said, Prime Minister, I was so proud of him. Think of the courage this took for Prime Minister Netanyahu to stand next to the most powerful man in the world and make a statement like this. He said, he sat alongside President Barack Obama on Friday and declared that Israel would not withdraw to the 1967 borders to help make way for an adjacent Palestinian state. Obama had called on Israel to be willing to do just that thing. Last, Prime Minister Netanyahu said, he said his nation could not negotiate with newly constituted Palestinian unit governments, and that includes the radical Hamas movement, which refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist and is committed to Israel's production. And Mr. President, those are the 7 reasons that I believe the land belongs to Israel. We need to respect that, and we need to declare, God bless Israel. Mr. President, I know I've got just a couple of minutes left. I would like to cover one last thing because